So this is the first Tech Hour of 2022, another year, the second year I've been running the Tech Hour. And what I'm trying to do this month is to set things in place for the next year. So last year I didn't exactly know what I was wanting to do. And the only thing I had in my mind was, well, if I open up these meetings, then maybe some people from the UK will turn up and that will help keep the UK tech community alive. And there's been some success at that, but it didn't stop UK TUG dissolving itself, which is a great shame, I think. However, I got things out of it, and I think other people did, that I didn't expect. And one of the things that was a big surprise was that there's a lot of interest in accessibility and in changing things. So accessibility, I think, is one of the big things in the world of tech for last year and this year and a few years to come. And in many ways, it's an Achilles heel of tech, which is very good at visual typesetting to paper, but not for creating accessible outputs. So my wish today is to think from the beginning about what things are, think from scratch what the beginner's experience is. And certainly myself, Philip and Nelson go back to the 80s or the 90s, and the relationship between paper and the web browser was very different then than it is now. I also thought that we could let B stand for basics, as in, what are the basics of what we're doing and how do you relate to them and how do we communicate with them? So that's perhaps enough for an introduction, except I'll say a few words about myself, which is that I've been using tech since 1989, I think, on an old PC. Since 2003, I've been working for the Open University, except I retired 4 years ago. And so now I get to choose what I do and I don't get paid for it. And my main activities besides tech are mathematical research and what might loosely be called personal development. I think that's probably enough for now. And if Nelson, Philip and Anne would like to introduce themselves, that would be really nice.
Okay, I'll go next then. So I'm the one in all of these meetings that's been around the longest in the tech world, because I started, I think, in 1978 or 79 when I got invited to a meeting at Xerox where Don Knuth was talking about his work on tech. And it really changed my life, because one of the things that had bothered me as a scientist was that we spent a lot of time in experimental areas doing experiments and as theoreticians doing computer computations, but ultimately we have to describe what we do, and we didn't have any good way of doing it beyond typewriters, which were then in those days run by secretaries, and you wrote up a manuscript perhaps by hand or on the typewriter and passed it off to someone who had to do it all over again. And it was very painful, because my field of quantum theory is full of Greek letters and special symbols and mathematics. So it was a great revelation to see how much progress Don had made in his first attempt at creating a typesetting system. I mean, it was remarkably good for essentially at the time a one-year project. And he thought that's all it would take. It turned out to take a decade, and spawned several PhDs at Stanford. I got involved in developing DVI drivers. These are the software tools that take the output of tech, which is a compact binary file, and turn it into something that you can display on a particular device, such as a printer or a screen, or in PostScript for display on various devices. And in the early 90s became president of the Tech Users Group, and continued to work on tech-related software, bibliographic software. And yesterday I started the 2022 effort in building tech live on a great number of platforms. This is an international team that every year about this time starts work for about 3 to 4 intensive months to make sure that TeX can be built on many systems, common operating system platforms that people use, and to ensure that nothing in the way of new software has broken things, which unfortunately has often been the case. And we have to then go back to the software developers and say, look, you can't do that because you've just broken a significant piece of software that gets distributed to of the order of 1 million people. So that's where I am today. I'm sitting here in the screen to my left, working on the HTML page describing the TeX Live 22 effort.
Thank you, Nelson.
Yeah, so I started using TeX in 1991 because I was advised to do so because I might need it when writing up my thesis, and it turned out I did. And I worked in cosmology for a while. Then I was young and needed the money, so I worked at the stock exchange for 20 years. Now I've taken early retirement and doing more cosmology again, and in fact using TeX just today. And I guess you wrote the DV-IPS, right?
Sorry, say again.
Did you write the DV-IPS driver?
No, that was Tom Rokicki. I wrote the DVI ALW driver for the Apple Laser Writer, which came before Tom's.
Yeah, okay, that's the one I used to use when I was at the observatory in Hamburg. I remember that one, yeah.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I still use that daily. So it produces a somewhat tighter postscript than Tom's does, but they both do a very good job of compressing what would otherwise be a fairly verbose stream of postscript if you just read the postscript book.
Amazingly, in the last 30 years, of course, I mean, we're having a video conference now, you know, and computing has changed by orders of magnitude, but LaTeX is still pretty much as it was 30 years ago. I still use it in the same ways. And in scientific publishing, it's still used for many, many, many journals. And it's good to have something which doesn't change sometimes. But I think the reason it hasn't changed is because it was just so good.
That's right.
And the small improvements which needed to be added, one can add, and without changing the basic underlying structure, and without having to relearn something completely different, which will be obsolete in 2 years.
Now, for a number of years, I've had a fair number of style guides on my shelf because I do a lot of technical writing myself, and I guide students in dissertations and theses. And a question came up recently about the proper punctuation of multi-line displays in mathematics. And I went to a number of books, including the TeX book and the Lamport's LaTeX guide and George Gretzer's book, Math into LaTeX, and a couple of others, and didn't find any clear advice, but I finally tracked some down, and I'll put up this book here. This is the 17th edition of the Chicago Manual of Style, and chapter 12 is entirely devoted to mathematical typography, and the only typesetting system that it mentions and actually has input examples from is LaTeX. And it had the rules that I was looking for to resolve the question as well. So that was a useful discovery, and I thought I would pass it on.
You mean in punctuating equations like they were parts of sentences with a comma at the end?
Right. So a question arose
Let's get back to this later and give Anne a chance to introduce herself.
So I don't really know it at all. And what little I know is just from trying to convert math and trying to get it so that students can actually have math read out loud, especially for students with disabilities, whether they're blind or dyslexic. And so I'm a total newbie. So go ahead and continue with your conversation. I'm just sort of a speck on the wall.
Okay, just very briefly, then the question was, when you had a block of text followed by a block of mathematics, how is the punctuation to be done? In particular, if you have A equals B, new line equals C, new line equals D, does punctuation follow each of those subcomponents or not? It turns out it doesn't. But if you have multiple equations with multiple left-hand sides, then each of them get punctuation, a semicolon or a period at the end of the equation block. Anyway, so this chapter in the Chicago Manual of Style is about 40 pages long, so there's lots of detail that's treated there, but it was nice to find a clearly laid out table of instructions for punctuation.
There are some people that like following rules and are lost without a rule to follow. And
well, you have editors who get very picky if you don't, you see. So I think technical authors really need to be aware of these issues.
no, I'm not saying that rules are necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that some people like them more than others.
I would rather format it properly myself rather than have someone say, well, that's wrong, we're going to try to reformat it and introduce more errors and so on. A long time ago, I defined a macro called math punct for math punctuation. And so depending on what I'm writing for, some people want more or less space before this punctuation after an equation, for example. And I mean, in some situations, a comma can actually be a mathematical symbol, right? And you don't want that confused with punctuation. And if I leave it out altogether, then I just define it to do nothing. And then I can always write in the same style and don't have to worry about it.
Okay, what I'd like to do, and I'm really glad that Anna's here, is gather some sort of user stories. And user stories are used in what's called agile software development to capture a description of a software feature from a user's perspective. So what is it that the user wants? What are the users trying to do? And in agile software development, the user story is a cheap and easily modified version of a requirement specification. And the idea is that if the software developer understands the user story, then that is a very important contribution to the requirements process. And the other thing is it ensures or helps ensure that the problem being tackled is actually the problem that needs to be tackled.
Well, by agile software development, it's not just a general description, it's a very specific program.
Yes, it's a sort of discipline with, as I said, rules. But you can user stories can be used pretty much in any area. And they also involve the user having, in some sense, a persona and perhaps even a name. In politics, you sort of have something like user stories in terms of sorry, I'm confused because we're talking about two different countries. How does it play in Boza, Idaho, and Des Moines? So there's those sorts of stereotypes, archetypes of what people are. And for Anne's, because Anne's here, one of the user stories is, I want to create some mathematics that can be read out. I think that's what Anne said, at least in so many words. And that's not a user story that I had in 1989. In particular, there weren't any commonplace text-to-speech converters. It was some time before my computer had any audio other than the beeps from the loudspeaker when it powered on. So I think, to a certain extent, one of our problems is how to get 2022 user stories. And perhaps by accident, perhaps by design, Overleaf found that one of the most important user stories was, I'm writing a paper and I have a collaborator. Because several people I've spoken to says, Well, overleaf is very good because it helps me collaborate with other people. And that's a user story, you see, because I have a collaborator and I want to work with my collaborator. So getting the user stories right are quite important. Something I do know from the little I know about accessibility is that a lot is done by sighted assistants. And sometimes the solution is not to do software, but to ask the sighted assistant to do something. So we shouldn't think that the solution to all problems is software. It's just the one, it's just the one we're used to using. It's the one we're used to having. It's just like if you have a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And if you're psychologically skilled, then you want to look at the emotional underpinnings of everything. And all points of view are points of view and so valid. The other thing
to interject just to interject in there with you think, you know, a lot of people that may be, and you're thinking more of blind or totally visually impaired somebody may possibly use a sighted individual, but they don't want to. They don't want to have to be dependent on somebody else. And not only that, if they do get to the PhD level, from my experience with them, they don't want to have to depend on that person's interpretation of what they've done. They may not, their sighted person may not be at the same level of knowledge. And so they're interpreting their work without them being able to go back through and check it. Right? Even if they're able to produce it in Braille or Nemeth Braille or whatever, there's still somebody in there that's producing that for them, so that they have to depend on somebody else to depend on it. Where if we can get software that can read it out loud, exactly what they've done with their errors, then that empowers that person a lot more. And not all of our people with disabilities that might need this read out loud necessarily are vision impaired. We have students that have dyslexia or dyscalculia that need to have it read out loud because they can't actually see how it's printed out on the print or on the screen. So being able to hear it and see it helps them to understand exactly what the equation is. So whatever they're trying to do, whether they're trying to learn math for the first time. Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah. You're a domain expert, Anne.
Well, yeah, and what I've run into with dealing with, textbook publishers is that's their whole attitude is that, well, it doesn't have to read out loud. You'll just have to hire somebody to sit with the student that needs help. Well, right now, we have something like 25% of our population have some kind of a disability, whether it's a print disability, but quite a few of them have a print disability. We don't have the kind of funding to have somebody sit with all of them and read their books out loud to them, let alone having people that have the expertise to be able to read that math out loud. I don't necessarily know all of the math symbols and how they're read out. What do they mean? What does that equation mean? My math didn't go that far. I know at our college, at linear algebra, and I'm like, what the heck is that? I don't know what that is. Okay. So how would you read that out loud to a student that's trying to learn it? Or how do you convert that? I don't even know how to make sure that the software that we have, the readers that we have, how to make the readers read it out loud correctly.
Yeah, and as an example, since linear algebra is very strongly in my background, it's a field in which the distinction between Roman type and bold type is extremely significant, because Roman type is used for scalar operations and bold type for matrix and vector operations. And if the screen reader just reads AX equals B, you don't know whether that means scalar multiplication or matrix multiplication. And I suspect that's not something that is terribly well dealt with by screen readers, because I suspect they probably don't pay much attention to fonts. And yet in mathematics, fonts are often rather carefully chosen. For example, blackboard bold symbols have been widely used in mathematics for perhaps a couple or 3 centuries. are now part of Unicode because mathematicians need them. So a blackboard bold symbol for N or Z or Z or N, those have special meanings in number theory that are well known to mathematicians, but to a casual reader, they would just be a funny way of writing those letters.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And that's the problem I have in converting that and trying to get it read, because I don't know how it's read.
Yeah.
So you don't know what the right answer is, even if it's given to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the problem is, if the matrix algebra is written out in scalar form, it becomes incredibly complex because you have rows and columns with things with subscripts and superscripts. And if I just think back to thinking of a linear equation solution or an eigenvalue problem, if someone were to read it to me, I just would not be able to grasp it. But if you say it's AX equals B or AX equals lambda X, then it's a linear equation or an eigenvalue problem, and I know very well what it means.
Yeah. And then if you're looking at a, like a Braille note or something where it has one line of Braille, how do you, explain that equation to somebody that it doesn't have the superscripts or the subscripts?
Right.
You only have one line. I mean, it becomes a big issue for somebody that's blind.
Yeah, and so Anne, in Braille transcription of scientific material, is there any mention of a font in the Braille, or is it just the letters that you see?
Sometimes, I mean, they can show it as bold, but a lot of times most schools try to do things audibly because Braille takes, thousands of dollars to produce. I mean, some math books, can cost upwards of, $20,000 to $30,000 to produce in Braille.
Okay.
So, yeah. So if we had software that could read that, it'd be wonderful.
It's interesting. Yesterday, I sent a note to Jonathan about a paper I uncovered on web accessibility for people with disabilities. The paper was written in a journal, IEEE Professional Communications, Transactions on Professional Communications. And it was written in the year 2000. And when I went through the list of difficulties that they raise for people with vision defects, motion handicaps, and so on, dyslexia, these really haven't changed. And the only thing that might have changed is that the technological solutions 22 years later are marginally better, but I still don't think they're widespread.
I remember a colleague saying that, this was 3 or 4 years ago, that he almost never writes emails anymore. He dictates them. And in several languages, speech recognition has become so good that he doesn't need to type anymore.
Yeah, that's certainly useful for some people. And I think would work reasonably well when the email messages are essentially plain text and relatively short. But I find a lot of my email traffic involves cutting and pasting comments from other people and adding my own comments. And I essentially end up with a small essay in my email messages.
That's why Twitter.
Dictation would never work.
That's one of the benefits of Twitter. It forces people to keep their message simple. Sometimes sometimes it leads to oversimplification. And I wanted to ask you if you know about the people at Puget Sound who work on what's called the pretext system for creating accessible outputs from XML.
No, I haven't heard about them.
Oh, great. Well, when I say great, I'm glad I told you about this. So,
But real quickly, to get back to Nelson's point about using dictation, if you do use Dragon Naturally Speaking as your means of communicating with your computer, there are macros and stuff that you can run that can cut and paste sections and paste them into your email for you. So you can actually use your entire, your voice to manipulate your computer without ever touching your keyboard.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I've got a question then, which is, how much do I need to know as an author of mathematics in order to produce accessible outputs further down the line? I mean, clearly, perhaps clearly, I don't need to know Braille.
No, you don't need to know Braille, because chances are that if it needs to be brailled, you're going to send it off to somebody that's their job is to braille it.
Right. So what do I need to know?
But mainly what you need to do is to make sure that what you're doing, I mean, even, when Nelson was talking about the syntax of it, that may be what the Chicago manual says, but what is the screen reader saying? How is the screen reader dealing with that punctuation? One of the hardest things that I have with, reading things out loud is that publishers have a tendency of ending the end of the page in the middle of a sentence and then putting in a page number and then the title or the title of the chapter. Well, if you just, go through them and just rip out the text, that's all in there. So if you're trying to read it, so you imagine in the middle of a sentence, you all of a sudden have page 256, title, blah, 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 and then it goes on to the rest of the sentence.
So there
are a lot of issues like that where if I think publishers were a little bit more conscious of where things landed and tried to make sure that paragraphs ended on a page. And I know sometimes that doesn't happen, but a lot of times I think publishers look at textbooks with an awful lot of what we call eye candy, where they put fancy letters at the beginning of sentences and chapters and things, and those don't come across really well with screen readers.
Not to mention a calligraphic elephant or something like that at the beginning of a paragraph.
Yeah. And then when you get to a math equation in the middle of a sentence, forget about it. It just, even if it's done correctly, if they then create it as a PDF, then everything that you've done goes away. So
you're mainly working from, you're mainly talking about things available in PDF, which you want to make accessible to people who need a screen reader.
Yeah, or just even being able, not necessarily a screen reader, because some things that work with a screen reader doesn't necessarily work very well with text to speech, which are two separate softwares.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so a screen reader will read absolutely everything on the screen to you, and you can, by using the keyboard, you can manipulate. You don't even need a screen, right? If you're using a screen reader.
Right.
My boss was totally blind, and she's like, I don't need the monitor. What do I need the monitor for? Right? And I said, well, you need the monitor because I don't know what it is you're doing. That was for me to follow along, right?
That's why it's called a monitor.
That's why it's called a monitor. And we were trying to buy a piece of software for our office. And we actually had from Microsoft, 3 of the engineers come over to explain to them why we couldn't buy the software. And he was like, okay, we'll navigate to the site. And he told her the site. She goes to the site and he says, well, go ahead and log in. And she kept doing everything. She's tabbing, she's entering, she's doing everything. She can't get into the login box because they didn't code it correctly. And the head engineer got so mad at her. He says, well, just use the mouse and go there. Well, she can't. What's she going to do with the mouse? She can't see where the pointer is. So I reached up and I turned the monitor off, and he about hit the ceiling. He goes, what'd you turn the monitor off? I said, that's what she sees. And he goes, oh, he had more of an idea where he was coming from. But you're saying, this is the user's experience.
Yeah. This reminds me of a Zen story about a blind monk who went to visit somebody and was going home afterwards. And this is in the old days before we had electricity. And his host said, take this lamp with you. And the blind person says, what do I need it for? And his host said, well, so other people can see you. And so he did that. And on the way home, he and somebody else bumped into each other. And the blind person said, "Didn't you see my light?" And the other person said, "Your light has gone out, brother." I can send you a link for that if you want it.
Yes, please do.
So that's a sort of example where, what's the word? There's a sort of fixed idea that has to be knocked out of place. It needs to be let go out. Or the idea that the person's got a mouse and knows how to use it. Oh, well, hello, William. Welcome. Happy New Year.
Yeah, same to you.
We've got Anne here who's an accessibility officer. I think that's roughly the right description, from Washington State.
Yeah. It's -2 here.
-2. Okay. I think you're the coldest so far. I have frozen puddles, and Nelson is in the low zeros. You're muted, Nelson.
Yeah. Now I'm +5 Celsius.
+5.
So it's quite nice.
It's about the same here.
Oh, I'm Fahrenheit.
Old money, as we call it in England. So Anne was talking about some of the difficulties and challenges and other experiences as in her work in Washington. And the theme for this is beginners. And the thought went to my mind, well, maybe we should think of, in the context of accessibility, maybe the person who's experienced in tech is actually a beginner in terms of generating stuff that works through the accessibility pipeline. So how that's an area that might sort of fit us, this group of 5, a bit better than I'm 20 years old and I'm just learning tech or having to do something with math at college, because none of us, because we're all rather distant from that experience.
Well,
So,
I have 2 granddaughters. One is out of college, the other's still in. And I've tried to talk both of them into using LaTeX, and I failed miserably. And it's not, I don't think, because they have any accessibility problems, but Word is good enough for them. And I was surprised a little bit over Christmas. My one granddaughter came up to me and said that I would be glad to know that someone she knows has tried to talk her into using LaTeX. So that's 2 people who tried and failed.
so it's not just up to you, William.
Yeah. And my interest in LaTeX is a couple of years ago, I was using Word, and I finally decided that, or rather I recalled that, hey, I used to use LaTeX a little bit. Maybe I should try that again. And so I've abandoned Microsoft Word, and I now do everything in LaTeX, which is not too much. I was using it a lot to take notes for me trying to learn Latin, and I use it to write letters. Not many people write letters anymore, but my brother and I have been carrying on a correspondence for a number of years, and so I've switched to using LaTeX for that. And my problem is with my age, I learn things and I know how to do things, or at least I find out how to do things, and then I promptly forget them. So I save all of my LaTeX so I can go back and see how I used to do things, and I relearn it and relearn it and relearn it. So my accessibility is coming down the road because of decreased eyesight and and other things.
Yeah. Word is got a lot of advantages, let's put it that way.
Well, it certainly doesn't have the learning curve that LaTeX requires, you know, for anything really advanced, but for just general everyday use, Word is probably a lot easier to use.
Yeah, it's also something that is a known quantity. So if you're looking to hire somebody, you can ask for proficiency in Word, and you know, and they know sort of pretty much what's required. Whereas proficiency in LaTeX is, what's the word? Much rarer skill, if you like.
Well,
so LaTeX is a bit niche, let's put it that way.
I kind of liken LaTeX to Perl. I think Perl is a lot like LaTeX in the sense of having what you need to learn to use it. So people don't like to use Perl because Python is much more, how should I say, less esoteric.
Yeah.
However, I have never used word processors other than to type 2 or 3 words in as a test when I've installed it for somebody. But the problem with word processors is that they generally have had proprietary formats. It's a little better now that OpenOffice, the LibreOffice document formats are supported by other commercial word processors. But historically, a document you wrote in one of these commercial systems wouldn't be usable 2 or 3 years down the road because they introduce incompatible changes. And the beauty of LaTeX is that the markup that you wrote in 1985 works perfectly fine today. And I've taken documents written about that vintage 25 plus years ago, and they typeset flawlessly today. And that's exceedingly important in science. We really want to have documents that last a long time, and having visible markup also means that you have some chance of dealing with it by simple tools. For example, stripping out markup is a relatively trivial job with regular expressions. But if you have a Word document, it's a complicated binary format with pointers to where the characters go on the page. And recovering something sensible from that is quite hard. Well, yes, you can dump it in a text form, but you're still forced to use a GUI to do that, and there's no way to automate the process. The beauty of TeX is that you can really automate the production of large document processing systems. 20 plus years ago, there was a small publication that was on the shelves of every supermarket in the United States and Canada called TV Guide. And in the late 80s, early 90s, the people who produced that actually switched to using TeX to produce it because it was essentially a database-driven publication. They would get current schedules in various channels, and they would print local documents for each community. And TeX made it easy to automate that process, which was a big improvement over what they had before. Telephone directories in a number of countries have been done that way for the same reason. But it's true, if you're just writing a letter to your friend, you probably aren't ever going to look at that letter again after the next few days. but that's not true in science.
I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this question, which is, Nelson's quite rightly said, LaTeX has got these tremendous advantages. And that's appealing to values that Nelson has, but there may be, let's put it another way, handwriting could be quite attractive, and it's quite nice to get a handwritten letter if it's sort of nicely written. But
not for me, it isn't. You couldn't read it.
yeah, precisely. You know, so I did just done a search called "Why should I use LaTeX?" or "Why use LaTeX?" And
did all of the hits refer to the software?
yes, they do. Although it may be that Google knows who I am. I'm pleased that they all refer to the software. But actually, all the results, so to speak, seem all a bit random in the sense that they're not coming from any sort of definitive source, you know, like the Tech Users Group. So I'll just put this link into the chat. So one of the things for beginners is, well, why should I use LaTeX? And one of the problems I think beginners have is hand holding and that sort of thing. So making an appropriate decision as to whether to use LaTeX and how to use LaTeX, it doesn't help anybody for people to use LaTeX when it's not appropriate for them. So good answers to why use LaTeX and good advice on using LaTeX is something that relates to beginners quite a bit, I think. And that's certainly coming out of what William said with his grandchildren. If there was a site you could go to that spoke to them in their language, so to speak, in their context, that might also be helpful. So to me, that's a nice outcome from our discussion, is trying to improve the outcome of searching for why use LaTeX. And I see that as a beginner's question. That's a beginner's question, why use LaTeX?
No, I think my main reason for using it is the input is simple and the output is under your complete control.
For me, the reason is it's the only system that typesets mathematics and everybody else uses it.
Yeah, I count that as under your control.
Well, I don't know if it's under my control because...
Well, but you can do it. There's almost nothing you can't do with text to produce something on a printed page.
I'd like to have the whole document consist of numbered paragraphs, including the theorems. But I don't have the time and energy right now to hack into the theorem environment so that the theorem number appears to the left of the theorem is in fact the paragraph number. And by chance, I looked at a book from 1992, I think it was, and it seems to be thinking in the way that I wanted to think. And they ended up putting sort of equation numbers in the left-hand column, left hand of the page in bold, so they can get that sort of granularity. But it seems to me clear that they haven't actually managed to do what they wanted to do. They've just settled for what they can. So the idea that, for me, the idea that it's all under my control, it's about as useful as saying, well, this software is written in Perl, it's all under your control. But 20 years ago, I might have agreed with your answer, William. But at the moment, I find myself reluctant to write TeX macros because the stuff that I want to do just doesn't seem to be possible. And the LaTeX people are having tremendous difficulty and having to rewrite large parts of LaTeX in order to solve the problem that Anne was talking about earlier before you arrived, I think, that screen readers will come to the page break and then read the page number and then read the chapter title on the next page. And tagged PDF will solve that, but it's really very, very hard to persuade to program LaTeX so it will produce such output.
Well, I think my point was that you can do it. That doesn't mean it's easy to do it.
Yeah, and with regard to having it under your control, usually I stick with the style, LaTeX class, whatever I need, and it's usually fine and it's usually obvious how to do things, but occasionally something bothers me. And I don't spend a lot of time writing macros, but I've always found a solution. I just put one in the chat. Maybe someone will guess what problem it's supposed to solve. So sort of fine points like this, it's usually something you can get an answer from a tech guru, within a day or two. If you describe the problem succinctly, someone will say, well, define this, and then you're done.
I will agree with William regarding it being open source. And in that sense, it is under your control in the sense that it's open source. And even if it's completely compiled, you or somebody else can change the source code and make it behave differently. So in that sense, I agree it's under your control, and that's something I do highly value.
Another advantage was brought home this past weekend when my wife came to me with a printout of a document she had written some time ago, and she said, I can't find this on my computer. So she uses a word processor, and I thought about the problem and realized because word processor documents are binary formats, even if I could easily find all of the files on a computer, I still couldn't find the contents that had the particular text that she had. And so we had to resort to guessing what kind of file name she might have used, and eventually found a related document, not the one she wanted. But with LaTeX, this would have been trivial in the Unix world because a one-line find command piped into grep would have found exactly the document we were looking for. And I'm sure it's a problem that people face all the time, because if people use computers for years, more and more files accumulate and they just don't remember how they've organized them. And frankly, most people don't do a good job of organizing their computer files. I have colleagues with several thousand files on their desktop because they live in a flat world of one directory where everything is there, and they don't even name their files with extensions that indicate the contents. Whereas those of us who are more experienced with computers tend to divide things up into directories associated with projects and exploit the hierarchical nature of the file system. But it is a big issue, and Apple has a facility called Searchlight or Spotlight, one or the other, that indexes contents of documents, but I'm not aware that there's something comparable in the Windows world. There might be, but I'm not a regular Windows user.
Playing devil's advocate, you've bought into the world of Unix. Good for you. Other people have bought into the world of Microsoft.
Right, but they can't use their computers the way I can, because they live in a world where everything is point and click one thing at a time, and it's completely impossible to automate what they're doing. And I do tasks that require a huge amount of automation, where I might want to process several million documents, doing something to them. And that would be unthinkable in a point and click environment. So I think people who live in the Windows, and to a great extent the Mac OS world as well, tend to be relatively casual users of computers for whom their files probably don't have long-term significance. They're not doing scientific research where things have to be preserved.
Right.
And they're not thinking of producing documents to be read by others, such as books and scientific papers. But if you're in the latter camp, you really need the tools to help you do that job well.
Yeah, so most people are casual users of computers, and many of them don't even think of their computers being a computer. They think of it as being their mobile phone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And there are far more CPUs than people on Earth now.
Yeah. So if we go back to why use LaTeX, is it only a niche product? I mean, certainly it has its niches, like a mathematics PhD, but is it only a niche product?
I don't know if it's true, but I've read claims that the scientific publishing industry has more turnover than Apple or Google or huge companies like that. I don't know if it's true, but it's certainly scientific publishing. If you look at just the number of pages produced per year, that's a huge market, and much of that in the STEM fields is done with TeX.
Oh yes, but it's done by typesetting houses that are very specialized.
Yeah, but the users, I'm thinking of the users. Everyone who's a physicist uses LaTeX, right?
Okay, so
Mathematicians probably as well. Yeah.
Well, I would say that being a research physicist is a niche occupation. I mean, it's a very important niche occupation, just like being hydraulic engineer. Perhaps less niche than being a hydraulic engineer.
Sure, but how many pages of output does the average person produce in terms of, I'm not talking about, text messages, SMS or whatever, but, things which are a printed page or something descended from it. I mean, most people don't spend their lives writing books or articles. But of those that do, I think LaTeX is probably still a significant fraction because of the scientific publishing. And I didn't know that TV Guide, does it still exist, by the way?
I haven't seen it in many years, so I suspect not. Everybody gets their schedules on their mobile devices.
Yeah.
Most TVs today are not TVs, they're computers.
That's correct.
What about the Radio Times? Does it still exist?
What?
And the Radio Times?
It does. You can get it on the web.
But not as a printed magazine anymore.
It might do. I don't go into the news agencies very often.
It's the evolution, because most people bought it for the television program that was called the Radio Times.
Oh, well, that was because it was the Radio Times.
Exactly.
Well, it's certainly got a website. Magazine offer. Yeah, you can buy it, get it delivered to your home.
See, here at Utah, I sit in the College of Science, which has 4 departments: chemistry and biology at the south end of our campus, and physics and mathematics at the north end. Physics and math are almost exclusively LaTeX users and document producers. Biology and chemistry are 100% Word. We've had an occasional student from chemistry who did a thesis in LaTeX. But, and we have the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Chemical Society, the world's largest chemical journal, here in our chemistry department, and my wife worked for him for 20 years. So in that world, word processors are essentially the only thing that people use. Behind the scenes, it gets turned into SGML and by big commercial printing firms. I came across a biology journal a number of years ago that I was surprised at its size. It was about 20,000 pages a year. And that at that time, I thought that was a record because that was much larger than any mathematics or physics journal was. But I recently came across an open access journal that IEEE established just a few years ago. It's now producing 250,000 pages a year. It just boggles the mind that there's that much publication going on in a single field.
Is it a high quality journal, this open access IEEE?
I suspect so. I mean, IEEE journals have a pretty good record of having good material. They're all refereed, and it's just that the volume is such that I think most engineers and scientists would despair at trying to keep up with the literature of that magnitude. The Public Library of Science and Nature and Science journals as well produce, those are journals that produce weekly issues. And while they're very famous in the sense that they have very high citation ratings, they're also journals in which in a given issue, there's very little content of interest to a particular scientist, but people follow them because famous papers have been published in them. There's a whole book that's recently been written about the history of the journal Nature, which is a British journal that which was the precursor of, or the inspiration for the American Journal of Science. And certainly they're important journals, but the problem is for a scientist to follow what's going on. I think today we're utterly overwhelmed in the amount of published material. This wasn't the case 75 years ago, pre-World War II. A scientist, any field, could easily keep up with the literature because there were a handful of journals, a half a dozen or 10 perhaps, that they could follow, and there was no great difficulty in that. But now, post-World War II, with the much larger number of people going on to secondary and college education levels, and many more scientists and engineers being produced, the literature has just become extremely large. And of course, it's unfortunate because what it means often is that people do things that have already been done, perhaps not in their field, but in a related field, but that they're not aware of it because they haven't read the literature. And their argument is, well, I can't keep up with it. So what am I to do? I'll just go off and do my thing and I'll write my own paper. And that's, of course, why a referee process for journals is very important, because you expect to have senior scientists and mathematicians looking at incoming articles and identifying those that are simply rediscovering things that have been well known to the more senior people.
We've got to use story now. Keep up with the literature.
Yeah.
How do I keep up with the literature?
It's very, very hard because, just simple keyword searches. Google, for example, has a facility where you can register keywords you're interested in, and they will send you email messages several times a week about new web pages that have those keywords. And that's of some utility, but if the keyword is very narrow and of interest to few people, you won't get many returns. But if it's a broad topic, if you say, I'm interested in football, well, there's such a huge amount of interest worldwide in that sport that there will be large numbers of returns, and it becomes very difficult to filter it in any sensible way.
2 years ago, some people came across wanted to have an eigenvector identity, And somebody contacted Terry Tower and said, have you seen this before? And he said, well, no, I haven't, but here's a proof. And subsequently, they found that the results had been rediscovered in various forms all the way going back to something like 1830, perhaps not as long as that. And its title is Eigenvectors from Eigenvalues. I just put a link to it in the chat. And I came across an organization that wants to help solve that sort of problem. I'm not saying it's a new problem or an old problem, but yeah, there's a lot of people out there and there's a lot of stuff out there. And getting attention is half, if you like, half the problem. And that's what the major journals are about, is they have their community of readers.
Yeah. And as example of trying to help with this, the American Mathematical Society and the European Mathematical Society have agreed on a common set of 5-letter codes for particular areas of mathematics, and journals that are published in mathematics tend to have those codes listed in the front matter of each article. And you can look up in the EMS and AMS databases with those codes, and you can narrow things down to a very narrow area of mathematics that you might be interested in. But most other fields don't have that. And I think it's a real challenge. The mathematics literature of the 4 departments in my college is much smaller than the chemistry, physics, and biology literature. And I think the biology literature probably dwarfs everybody's. I'm glad I'm not a biologist, just because I would feel very bad about not being able to keep up with what is happening. At least in mathematics, in the areas of numerical mathematics I'm interested in, I do follow all of the key journals, and I have a pretty good idea of what's happening in that area.
We have several million species of beetle.
Yes, and there are probably scientific papers about each of them.
Yeah, and why not?
Right. But I think it's a real challenge for people working in such areas that mathematicians probably are the most famous among academic people for finding very, very narrow niches that they work in. And sometimes there are mathematicians who worked in areas where maybe only 2 or 3 other people in the world are working in that area. And so they know what's happening because they know there's 2 or 3 other people. But if you're in the field of medicine or biology, the field is much larger. One of my colleagues, who is a physician, told me that he once looked at how many journals there were in medicine, and this was back in the 1980s, and he found a list that enumerated more than 6,000 of them. The list ended with the Zimbabwe Journal of Nursing. But that's an enormous literature to deal with. And, over the last 20 years, this so-called science of citation indexing has achieved a fair number of, a fair amount of following, and there are half a dozen journals devoted to it. And what they attempt to do is to assign a numerical value to the importance of an article based on the number of citations to it. And in some science departments, certainly physics and chemistry, people are very aware of what their citation index rankings are, because it matters for the grant proposals and for their promotion and tenure and pay. But it also has the problem that if you work in a small area where very few people are doing similar things, you will have a small number of citations. If you work in a popular area, you might be lucky and have a large number. But if you're in the narrow area, you will never get a large number. And what this tends to do then is to force everybody to work on the popular problems, the flavor of the month. And I think this is extremely bad for science. Science has progressed over the last 2,000 years by single individuals going off and thinking deeply about a problem and coming up with new ideas that nobody else had ever thought of. And that's how key advances have been made. And we all benefit in our modern society from those things that happen in mathematics and physics and chemistry, biology and medicine and so on. You know, our lifespan is close to triple what it was 200 years ago on average, thanks to sanitation and medicine. So these are important activities, but I think trying to rate people based on how often their papers are cited is not the right thing to do. But it's simple for administrators because they can make pie charts and bar charts and
of course, you've also got the problem that
by attaching numbers to people.
still try to game the system.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly some of the, I mean, there's been some real growth. I remember Richard Feynman wrote that before the war, he used to read the entire physical review, not just the papers in his field, the entire thing, which I think would be physically impossible today. It's just not enough.
Because it's a book about a volume this thick every week.
Exactly.
You're looking at probably 500 to 700 pages a week of very complicated technical material.
And it just wouldn't be possible. And I remember an essay written by Isaac Asimov in the, must have been late 60s, early 70s when it was written, talking about how difficult it's become to keep up with the literature. But back then it was all real. And these days, at least some of it is bogus growth. Online journals are so cheap that there's apparently a market for people who are willing to pay for subpar stuff to get published and people willing to publish it. And apparently some people actually use that in some sort of reward determination scheme. So there's a lot of noise now that when things were expensive, one advantage was most of the stuff that was published was actually good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are even not just fake journals, there are usually the same companies actually organize fake conferences. And they usually have a name like the journals. For example, there's a journal called Science and Nature. So you can say, I published in Science and Nature, right? And they often have names which are very similar to respected journal names, and conferences, similar names to respected conferences, usually in the same city, but a year later or something like that. And apparently some of them are just completely bogus and the proceedings are published and nothing ever happens. But in some cases, apparently there is actually a conference, but only 2 or 3 people actually show up. But it's a business model and it's apparently sustainable because people probably don't even read what people have published. They just read the publication list itself and maybe the citation metrics and things like that.
Yeah, that's why some of my colleagues who've had to serve on hiring committees tell me that for them, the most important material about a potential candidate is not the list of publications or a copy of their dissertation, but rather the letters of recommendation from people they know who know this individual, and they trust the judgment of their colleagues who are experts in the fields of the candidate much more than they do the papers that were published. And so in that sense, it makes it, you get hired based on who you know, in other words, an old boy network, and that isn't necessarily good, but it may be the best thing one can do, given that there are these journals where you can get almost anything published if you try hard enough or have enough money.
Well, I was thinking about why people don't use LaTeX, and the thought occurred to me that in some ways LaTeX is like a typist. In the old days, people would write longhand and they would have to get a typist to type it up, thesis or whatever, book, whatever. And then the result was a hard copy, and that was the end of it. Well, now you can have the same thing. Somebody writes something up and give it to somebody to put it in LaTeX, and it still gets printed. But are they using LaTeX? Well, indirectly, but it's kind of a technical skill almost. If you can learn the skill yourself, you can go directly to LaTeX and submit it.
Yeah.
It's possible that in 10 years' time, you can write mathematics neatly and it'll be OCR'd into LaTeX with a sufficiently high degree of accuracy to be useful. And perhaps an expert.
Well, then they better start teaching handwriting in school again.
Oh yeah. Well, if OCR is good enough, it will train people. You know, a good OCR will not only train itself, but train its users. And yes, teaching handwriting again. And in that case, LaTeX is still very important as a markup language and also as a typesetting system, but it's not one that most people need to know. And the same sort of goes with PostScript PDF. Most people don't create PDF. They use software that creates PDF for them using templates. And using OCR to create LaTeX output is a different form of templating. You're simply using some sort of machine intelligence to determine the templates that underlie the squiggles on the page. One doesn't need to know LaTeX in order to write mathematics with a pen and paper. Absolutely not. And I don't see anything wrong with that approach. I don't see that people necessarily need to type LaTeX. We were talking earlier that you can get many emails written by dictation. If you can create your math documents with handwriting, why not? They may even come out better.
But, you know, imagine someone sitting up to write a book in a word processor, whether it's a technical book or somewhat more informal one. They're essentially faced with a blank screen and they start typing. If you do this in LaTeX, you really have to come up with an outline of the book in the form of chapters and sections and title page and so on. And I think that organizational work, the notion that you have perhaps even a template file that you load into your text editor that has several sections and chapters already marked, and you just have to fill in the blanks, that really helps you to get your material organized and in the flow of consciousness that people have with the word processor. I think that's something that's terribly missing.
And I think that's behind the reason why people like to use Python instead of Perl.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that, William?
Well, Perl, in my mind, is just as well known as C, you know, C obfuscation contest, and you can do the same thing with Perl. And it's this ability to do that. You couldn't do that with Python or Java or anything like that. And it's that kind of capability that appeals to certain kinds of people. And I'm losing my train of thought here. But you don't have to write obfuscated C or Perl. You can write almost as good Perl as you can in Python. It's object-oriented, but it takes some talent to do that.
Sometimes less is more. Sometimes imposing restrictions sometimes allows more to be possible. I certainly believe that regarding functional programming and running on multiple core machines. There it's a sort of theorem that if you add another processor, your program will run quicker if you've written it in a particular way. And the particular way is that you don't use assignment statements, you use functional programming only. So I am genuinely in favor of imposing quite a few restrictions rather than making it a convention that you, well, it sort of depends, but there's a mixture of forces, there's a range of forces going on. I think that's the point. And in some circumstances, one point in the space is important and useful, and in another case, it's another. Sometimes you use the right tool for the job, and sometimes you use whatever's to hand.
I put my favorite Perl quote in the chat, and it's by David Jones, who I know because he wrote the web server I'm using on VMS, which is written in C, a multi-threaded application, which to my mind is an extremely complicated piece of software. So this is a professional programmer, and he thinks the source code for Perl, the source code, is rather confusing. But I think it's there's sort of two mentalities. You know, do you want to be cryptic? Do you want to be the wizard type, or do you want to write clear code which everyone can understand? And I've never used Python, but I understand that one of the motivations for it was it deliberately contrasting with Perl, not to have many ways to do something, but to have one way, one best way to do it.
Well, this may not help, but I consider myself to be just an ordinary person, ordinary programmer, maybe even subordinary. But anyway, when I was learning, or rather before I knew anything about Unix, our company got some Sun workstations, that was it. And so on the Sun workstation, I decided to learn about Unix. And the first thing I tried to learn was the VI editor. And I simply could not learn it. It was so foreign to me. But I stuck at it, and eventually I was able to use it. And along with that, I started to learn how to use Unix. And of course, one of Unix's claims to fame is the putting together a pipeline of programs to do your work. And the long and the short of it is that my introduction to Unix and how it worked, so to speak, felt natural to me. And later on, when I tried to learn Perl, it was the same thing. I couldn't get past the first few pages. And this is more an indication of my situation, because when I started, I was trying to learn the programming code for IBM 7090, and I couldn't get past the first paragraph. You know, what's a word? You know. Anyway, it's a mental thing, at least for me, to make to get over that bridge to a new way of thinking. And once you're there, you just don't want to go back. And that's the way it is with LaTeX. Once I could get over the learning curve for me, I didn't want to use Word anymore. And I think the reason is what I said before. Your output is the way you want it, a lot easier to do in LaTeX than it is, or usually than it is in Word, or it's impossible in Word to do it, or well, at any rate, I'll stop there.
Okay. I think we've sort of covered a lot of ground, and pleased to see everybody. Anne sent a message she has to go. Well done to her for sticking out for as long as she did. I think I've got everybody's address, so I can email you all tomorrow with some bits and pieces. And thank you all for coming. I think one of the user stories I got out of this is people need to keep up with the literature. And that, when you think about it, is a really strong motivation, because people want their papers to be discovered. And if using a system gives you a discovery advantage, then that's a big plus. I think that that's part of the success of the archive. If you put it up in the archive, your stuff will immediately become more easily discovered. And understanding people's motivation, what they're really trying to do, is, I think, an important part of understanding the user story. What is it that they're really trying to do? I'll stop at that point, and I hope I'll see you all again, if not next week, later in the year. And once again, Happy New Year. Be safe, be happy.
Yeah, same to all of you.
Anybody else?
Be mild.
May your weather be mild.